Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. The year was 1839 when plantation ledgers from Rosewood Estate in Natchez began documenting something extraordinary. Among the standard inventory records of enslaved persons, one entry stood apart, marked with annotations that would puzzle historians for nearly 2 centuries. The woman known as Celeste appeared in plantation owner Harold Whitmore's meticulous records, not with typical notations of age and field skills, but with descriptions serving an entirely different purpose. What Whitmore documented about her appearance would become the least disturbing aspect of this case. Within 18 months, events would unfold that defied every convention of the antebellum South, leaving behind evidence so troubling that much would be deliberately destroyed. Rosewood Estate stretched across 200 acres of prime cotton land along the Mississippi River. Its main house, featuring the imposing columns and wide galleries typical of prosperous plantations in Adams County. Harold Whitmore, then 48 years old, had inherited the property from his father in 1825 and built it into one of the region's most profitable enterprises. His wife had died of yellow fever in 1834, leaving him alone in the grand house, while his 2 sons, Thomas and William, had established their own business interests in Vicksburg. The purchase records from the New Orleans slave market, discovered in a private collection in 1967, show that Whitmore paid $2,800 for Celeste in March 1839, a sum that stunned even the auctioneer, who noted in the margin that the typical price for a young woman at that time rarely exceeded $800. A letter dated April 3, 1839, from neighboring planter Benjamin Alcott to his brother in Baton Rouge, questioned whether Whitmore had lost his senses, remarking that such extravagance suggested either extraordinary skills or something far more troubling. The overseer Marcus Brennan arrived at Rosewood in 1837, 2 years before Celeste, and his diary, preserved by his descendants and donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 1982, provides the first glimpse into what made this case so profoundly disturbing. Brennan's standard practice was to maintain the plantation's official ledgers, recording each enslaved person with their name, approximate age, assigned tasks, and any relevant skills or physical conditions that might affect their work capacity. The entries for the 63 other individuals held at Rosewood between 1839 and 1840 followed this utilitarian format precisely, with notations such as Samuel, age 32, field hand, strong constitution, or Martha, age 19, house servant, experienced in cooking. The entries for Celeste, however, occupied 17 pages of a separate ledger that Whitmore kept locked in his private study, a ledger that came to light only when the estate was liquidated in 1843. Dr. Patricia Thornton, a historian from the University of Mississippi who examined these documents in 1973, described them in her research notes as unlike anything she had encountered in 3 decades of studying plantation records. The pages contained detailed physical measurements recorded with obsessive precision, noting not just height and build, but the exact curve of facial features, the specific shade of skin tone compared to various artistic references, the texture and length of hair documented weekly. Margin sketches appeared throughout, rough drawings of hands, profiles, and eyes rendered with increasing skill as the months progressed. The entries were dated almost daily from March 1839 through July 1840, each one adding new observations that read less like inventory management and more like the private studies of a portraitist consumed by a singular subject. Whitmore's personal journal, discovered tucked inside a hollowed book in the estate's library during the 1923 renovation, contained an entry from April 1839 that Dr. Thornton would later cite as evidence of his deteriorating mental state. The passage, written in Whitmore's careful script, stated simply that he had acquired something he could not possess, describing a face that troubles my sleep and waking hours alike. By May 1839, barely 8 weeks after Celeste's arrival, Marcus Brennan's diary recorded a development that would raise questions among neighboring planters for months to come. The entry dated May 12th noted that the master had ordered the small cottage located 30 yards behind the main house, previously used for storage of linens and sewing supplies, to be cleaned and furnished as living quarters. The official plantation records listed this space as the seamstress quarters, a designation that might have seemed reasonable given that skilled seamstresses were sometimes housed separately to protect valuable fabrics and maintain quiet working conditions. However, Brennan's diary revealed his private doubts about this arrangement, noting that Celeste had shown no particular aptitude for sewing during her first weeks at Rosewood, and that the existing house servants had always managed such tasks adequately. More troubling to Brennan was the instruction that Celeste would no longer participate in morning roll call, the daily gathering where all enslaved persons were accounted for before being assigned their work. His entry from May 20th observed that she had not been seen in the fields, the kitchen, or any of the communal work areas for over a week. Letters discovered in the Charleston Historical Society archives in 1958 revealed that Whitmore's sister, Margaret Whitmore Sutherland, had begun hearing disturbing rumors by midsummer. In a letter dated July 8, 1839, to her longtime friend Eleanor Pritchard, Margaret wrote of her concern regarding improper arrangements at her brother's estate, mentioning that mutual acquaintances had questioned why a recently purchased slave woman was being kept in isolated quarters and seen only in the company of the master himself. Eleanor's reply, dated July 22nd, advised caution in addressing such delicate matters, but acknowledged that the situation appeared highly irregular and likely to invite scandal if it continued. By August, the whispers had spread throughout Adams County society. A diary entry from Sarah Alcott, wife of the planter Benjamin Alcott, who had earlier questioned the purchase price, mentioned declining an invitation to Rosewood, stating that she had no wish to witness whatever unseemly situation was developing there. The final entry in Marcus Brennan's diary, dated July 23, 1839, consisted of a single sentence that would haunt researchers for generations. "What he asks of me, I cannot do," Brennan wrote in a hand that appeared shaken compared to his typically steady script, followed by the words, "God forgive us all." The diary ended there, mid-page, with no explanation or context for what request had driven him to such desperation. A letter discovered among family papers in 1991, written by Brennan's wife Catherine to her mother in Tennessee, provided the only account of their departure from Rosewood. Dated July 28, 1839, and posted from Vicksburg, where they had stopped briefly before continuing north, Catherine wrote that they had left the plantation in the dead of night with only what we could carry, abandoning a position that had provided stable income and comfortable quarters for 2 years. She offered no details about the reason for their flight, stating only that her husband had witnessed things no Christian man should be asked to participate in, and that they would never speak of Rosewood again. The Adams County Courthouse records, examined during a comprehensive survey of antebellum legal documents in 1979, revealed that Marcus Brennan had appeared before Magistrate John Caldwell on July 25, 1839, and filed a sworn statement regarding his employment at Rosewood Estate. The statement was sealed by court order on the same day, with a notation indicating that the matter involved circumstances of a delicate nature affecting prominent citizens, and that public disclosure would serve no beneficial purpose. The seal has never been broken, and Mississippi law protects such historical documents from disclosure even after the passage of nearly 2 centuries. What can be determined from peripheral evidence is that tensions between Brennan and Whitmore had escalated dramatically in the weeks following Celeste's relocation to the cottage. Plantation supply records show that Brennan had been making increasingly frequent trips to Natchez to purchase items not typically needed for agricultural operations, including expensive fabrics, French perfumes, books, and musical instruments, all charged to Whitmore's accounts and all delivered to the cottage behind the main house. In November 1839, a traveling portrait artist named James Dalton arrived at Rosewood Estate, an event documented both in Whitmore's account books and in a series of letters Dalton wrote to his wife Emma in Philadelphia during his 3-week stay. Dalton, a respected portraitist who had painted several prominent families throughout the South, typically charged $150 for a full-length portrait. Yet a receipt discovered among his estate papers in 1947 shows that Whitmore paid him $450 for a single commission, a sum that represented triple his standard rate. The letters to Emma, preserved by the Dalton family and later donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, reveal that the artist found his time at Rosewood increasingly unsettling. In his first letter, dated November 4, 1839, Dalton mentioned painting the master's subject with unusual enthusiasm, noting the extraordinary quality of his model's features and predicting this would be his finest work. By his second letter, November 12th, his tone had shifted markedly, describing the atmosphere at the plantation as oppressive and mentioning that he was required to work in the cottage rather than his usual setup in the main house, a departure from customary practice that he found both inconvenient and strange. His final letter, dated November 20th, conveyed clear distress, stating that he had completed the portrait, but that Whitmore refused to allow him to transport it to his studio for final varnishing, as was his standard practice, insisting instead that the work remain at Rosewood permanently. Dalton wrote that the entire arrangement had become deeply uncomfortable, and that he witnessed a dynamic between master and subject that defied his understanding of proper relations. He expressed relief at departing, and mentioned that the generous payment, while welcome, felt somehow tainted by circumstances he could not adequately explain to his wife. The portrait's existence was confirmed in a 1952 estate inventory conducted when the abandoned Rosewood property was being assessed for sale, listed simply as large oil portrait, unsigned, subject unidentified, significant water damage. The inventory provided no further details, and despite extensive research, the portrait's current location remains unknown, leaving only Dalton's disturbed correspondence as evidence of what he had been commissioned to create. Through the winter months of 1839 into early 1840, Rosewood Estate effectively withdrew from the social fabric of Adams County, a retreat documented in the surviving correspondence of neighboring families who noted the conspicuous absence of the traditional Christmas gatherings and New Year celebrations that the Whitmore family had hosted annually for decades. The last recorded social event at the plantation occurred in October 1839, a small dinner party mentioned in the diary of a guest who noted nothing unusual except the master's distracted demeanor and early retirement from the evening's conversation. What transpired behind Rosewood's gates during those isolated months remained largely mysterious until 1891, when a woman named Ruth Chambers, then 73 years old and living in a freedmen's community near Jackson, gave testimony to a researcher from Fisk University who was collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved persons. Ruth had worked as a house servant at Rosewood from 1837 until the estate was sold in 1843, and her account preserved in the university archives, provided disturbing details about the winter of 1839. She described how all enslaved persons were strictly forbidden from approaching the cottage where Celeste lived, with Whitmore himself enforcing this prohibition with unprecedented severity, threatening immediate sale to anyone who violated the boundary he had established. Ruth recalled that the master visited the cottage multiple times each day, sometimes remaining for hours, and that those working near the main house could hear beautiful music drifting from the cottage windows after dark, piano melodies that Ruth identified as far more sophisticated than the simple hymns typically heard on plantations. Most troubling was Ruth's testimony that she had once glimpsed, through an uncovered window while retrieving laundry from a nearby line, Whitmore seated beside Celeste with books spread before them, clearly engaged in teaching her to read, an act that violated Mississippi law prohibiting the education of enslaved persons and carried penalties, including fines and imprisonment. Ruth stated that she never spoke of what she witnessed, fearing the consequences, but that the other house servants whispered among themselves about the master's obsession and the inevitable disaster they sensed approaching. In March 1840, exactly 1 year after Celeste's arrival at Rosewood, Harold Whitmore's sons made an unannounced visit from Vicksburg, an event that would mark a critical turning point in the unfolding tragedy. Thomas, the elder at 28, and William, 25, had maintained minimal contact with their father throughout the previous year, despite the relatively short distance between Vicksburg and Natchez, a fact that later correspondence suggests was intentional avoidance rather than mere business preoccupation. A letter dated March 18, 1840, from William to his wife Rebecca, discovered in a family collection donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 1963, described finding his father greatly changed, thin, and speaking in riddles, noting that the once meticulous planter seemed to have lost all interest in the management of his estate and spent his days in pursuits that William could not quite comprehend, but found deeply troubling. Thomas, more direct in his concerns, wrote to the family's lawyer, Samuel Morrison, in Natchez, on March 19th, requesting information about the legal procedures for declaring someone mentally unfit to manage their own affairs. A letter that Morrison's clerk preserved in the firm's files, along with a notation that the matter was of utmost delicacy given the family's prominence. The visit, intended to last at least a week, ended abruptly on the evening of March 20th, with both sons departing for Vicksburg before dawn the following morning. Ruth Chambers, in her 1891 testimony, provided the only account of what precipitated their hasty departure, recalling that she had been working in the main house on that evening when a violent argument erupted in the library, with Thomas's voice rising above all others as he shouted about abomination and inheritance, demanding to know what madness had possessed his father and whether he intended to destroy everything their family had built. Ruth stated that she heard furniture overturning and glass breaking, followed by Harold Whitmore's voice, barely audible, saying something about love transcending the laws of men, words that only enraged Thomas further before the confrontation ended with doors slamming and the sons storming from the house into the night. In May 1840, plantation records show that Harold Whitmore made a week-long journey to New Orleans, leaving Rosewood in the temporary management of a newly hired overseer whose tenure would prove brief and unremarkable. The purpose of this trip remained unclear until 1968, when a graduate student researching antebellum legal practices discovered a billing record in the archives of Mercier and Dubois, a prominent New Orleans law firm that had handled affairs for wealthy planters throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. The itemized bill, dated May 23, 1840, detailed charges for drafting 2 separate documents for Harold Whitmore of Adams County, Mississippi. The first item listed the preparation of a comprehensive last will and testament at the standard rate, while the second, noted with considerably higher fees, described the creation of what the clerk termed a testament of manumission and provision, a complex legal instrument requiring expertise in both property law and the intricate regulations governing the freeing of enslaved persons. The manumission document itself surfaced in the Adams County Courthouse during a 1979 survey of historical records, found misfiled among property deeds from the 1840s. The papers, dated May 25, 1840, bore Whitmore's signature and the notarization of a New Orleans attorney, yet they were never officially filed or executed, existing only as a drafted intention rather than a legally binding instrument. The document granted freedom to the woman identified as Celeste, approximately 22 years of age, described without the usual physical identifiers found in such papers, and bequeathed to her, upon manumission, the sum of $15,000, an extraordinary amount representing more than 5 times what Whitmore had paid to purchase her, barely 14 months earlier. Additionally, the testament designated a property in Philadelphia, purchased specifically for this purpose, according to the deed transfer records, to be held in trust for her use. Why Whitmore traveled to New Orleans to commission these documents, why he went to such elaborate lengths to prepare for Celeste's freedom and financial security, and most mysteriously, why he never filed the papers that would have made these provisions legally binding, remains one of the central enigmas of this case, suggesting that events overtook intentions before they could be realized. By the summer of 1840, evidence from multiple sources converged to reveal a development that would transform an already scandalous situation into an impending crisis with potentially explosive consequences for everyone involved. The testimony of a midwife named Sarah Dobbs, recorded in a deposition taken in 1842 during estate settlement proceedings, confirmed that she had been summoned to Rosewood in June 1840 to examine a patient whose identity was not disclosed to her initially, though she quickly understood the gravity of what she was being asked to assess. Dobbs stated that the young woman was approximately 3 months with child and in good health, though clearly distressed by her circumstances. Plantation supply orders from June through August 1840, preserved in the records of a Natchez merchant, show purchases of infant clothing, blankets, and various items associated with childbirth, all charged to Whitmore's account and marked for private delivery. Letters between neighboring plantation wives, discovered in various family collections over the decades, document the spreading scandal with increasing alarm. One particularly revealing letter from Martha Reynolds to her sister in Mobile, dated July 15, 1840, expressed horror at what everyone now understood to be occurring at Rosewood, questioning what sort of man would so thoroughly abandon all moral restraint and decency. The medical records of Dr. Henry Crawford, found in a university medical archive in 1981, show that Whitmore consulted him on 3 occasions between June and August 1840 regarding prenatal care and potential complications, but steadfastly refused to identify the expectant mother, despite the doctor's insistence that he needed to examine her directly. Most revealing are Whitmore's own journal entries from this period, which descended into increasingly frantic and disjointed passages referencing divine punishment and the price of corruption, acknowledging that he had violated every principle by which civilized society operates. An entry from late July speaks of elaborate plans to take Celeste north to Philadelphia, or perhaps to France, where she might live as she was meant to, as a free woman of means and education, though he seemed to recognize, even as he wrote these plans, that they might already be impossible to execute. On the night of August 12, 1840, something catastrophic occurred at Rosewood Estate, an event documented through scattered but consistent witness accounts that would later be pieced together by historians attempting to reconstruct what happened during those crucial hours. James Porter, who owned the adjacent property to the east, reported to county authorities the following day that he had been awakened sometime after midnight by sounds he could not precisely identify, but described as deeply unsettling, something between screaming and wailing that seemed to come from the direction of the Whitmore estate. A riverboat pilot named Charles Mason, whose vessel was making a late-night passage along the Mississippi, recorded in his log that, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on August 13th, he observed flames and heavy smoke rising from what appeared to be an outbuilding at Rosewood, though the fire seemed to be contained and under control by the time his boat had passed beyond visual range. Perhaps most significantly, a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Josiah Tucker noted in his diary that he had stopped at Rosewood on the afternoon of August 12th, seeking lodging, and had been turned away by a clearly agitated Harold Whitmore, who appeared disheveled and spoke in fragments about God's judgment and unbearable loss. The Adams County Sheriff's report, filed on August 13, 1840, stated that Deputy Samuel Griffith had responded to reports of a fire at the Whitmore plantation and found that a small cottage behind the main house had been partially destroyed, though the main structures remained undamaged. The report noted that Harold Whitmore was found in a disturbed state, covered in soot and appearing to have suffered some minor burns to his hands, but he refused to answer questions about how the fire had started or whether anyone had been injured. Celeste was not mentioned anywhere in the official report. A handwritten record from Thomas Bailey, a gravedigger who worked at the Rosewood Family Cemetery, showed that a coffin was ordered on August 13th and a burial conducted in the family plot that same evening, yet no death was ever officially registered with the county clerk, and the grave marker, according to descriptions from later visitors, bore no name or date. The weeks following the night of August 12th witnessed a flurry of activity at Rosewood that suggested a coordinated effort to contain and obscure whatever had transpired. Correspondence preserved in the Whitmore family papers shows that Thomas and William arrived from Vicksburg within 3 days of the incident and remained at the plantation for the next 2 months, an unprecedented length of time away from their business interests. Legal documents filed with the Adams County Courthouse between August and October 1840 reveal a systematic transfer of property, with significant portions of Rosewood's acreage and assets being deeded to the sons, effectively reducing their father's direct control over the estate. Most tellingly, plantation sale records from the forks of the road slave market in Natchez document that between late August and early November 1840, 43 enslaved persons from Rosewood were sold in multiple transactions to buyers from across the Deep South, from Texas to the Carolinas, a deliberate scattering that would have made it nearly impossible for anyone to gather consistent testimony about events at the plantation. Ruth Chambers, who remained at Rosewood through this period, recalled in her 1891 testimony that families were separated without warning, long-term residents sold away overnight, and an atmosphere of fear pervaded the quarters as people understood they were being dispersed to ensure their silence about something terrible that had occurred. A letter dated September 8, 1840, from County Clerk Robert Hastings to Mississippi Governor Alexander McNutt, discovered during a survey of gubernatorial correspondence in 1971, referenced irregularities in the Whitmore matter that had come to his attention through his official duties, but assured the governor that prominent citizens had intervened to resolve the situation quietly, to avoid scandal that would serve no one's interests and would only damage the reputation of Adams County's most established families. Perhaps most mysteriously, the Adams County Birth Registry for August 1840, examined during a genealogical research project in 1989, showed an entry for August 11th that had been heavily crossed out with ink, rendering the names and details completely illegible, with no marginal notation explaining the cancellation, a highly irregular practice in official records that were supposed to maintain an unalterable chronological account of all births within the county. Following the events of August 1840 and the subsequent dismantling of much of his estate, Harold Whitmore retreated into a profound isolation from which he would never emerge. The case notes of Dr. Henry Crawford, who continued to attend him through late 1840, described a patient suffering from severe melancholia and disorders of the mind, documenting visits where Whitmore appeared disconnected from his surroundings, often failing to recognize the physician or understand why he had been summoned. House servants who remained at Rosewood during this period, including Ruth Chambers, reported that the master could frequently be heard talking to empty rooms, carrying on conversations with someone who was not there, his voice alternating between tender endearments and anguished apologies. His journal entries from September through December 1840, examined by researchers after they were recovered from the estate, showed a marked deterioration in both penmanship and coherence, with passages that mixed fragments of poetry, desperate prayers, and disjointed memories that became increasingly difficult to decipher. One entry from October attempted to describe a dream in elaborate detail, while another consisted solely of a single line from scripture copied repeatedly until it filled an entire page. By November, the entries had devolved into scattered phrases that seemed to reference conversations or events without providing any context that would make them comprehensible to outside readers. Legal documents filed in January 1841 show that Thomas and William Whitmore successfully petitioned to have their father declared mentally incompetent to manage his affairs, with testimony from Dr. Crawford supporting the assessment that Harold Whitmore could no longer be trusted to make rational decisions regarding his property or person. The court appointed Thomas as legal guardian and granted him full authority over what remained of the Rosewood estate. Among the final coherent entries in Whitmore's journal, dated December 1840, was a passage that would haunt everyone who later read it, stating with terrible clarity, "I buried my heart with her," followed by a question that suggested something even more disturbing than what had already been uncovered. "The child lives," Whitmore had written in a shaking hand. "But where? They will not tell me." In the spring of 1923, more than 8 decades after the tragic events that had consumed Rosewood Estate, a construction crew hired to renovate the long-abandoned property for potential sale made a discovery that would reignite questions about what had truly occurred on that August night in 1840. The workers, employed by a Jackson-based development company, were demolishing what remained of the cottage behind the main house when a sledgehammer broke through what appeared to be a solid wall, revealing a cavity approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep that had been concealed behind false paneling. The foreman's report to the property owners, preserved in the company's archives, described finding a small hidden room that contained personal belongings, apparently untouched since they had been placed there decades earlier. Inside were items that painted a picture of a life far removed from the typical existence of an enslaved person in the antebellum South. Several leather-bound books included volumes of poetry by Wordsworth and Keats, a French grammar text with handwritten notes in the margins, and a copy of Paradise Lost with passages heavily underlined. Fine clothing, though deteriorated by time and moisture, suggested garments made from expensive fabrics in styles fashionable during the late 1830s. Sheet music for complex piano compositions bore notations in a delicate hand, indicating someone who had achieved considerable musical education. Most significantly, the workers discovered a polished wooden box containing what appeared to be locks of hair tied with ribbons, one set dark and another a lighter brown shade. A portrait miniature no larger than a pocket watch showing a young woman whose features suggested mixed ancestry, and a collection of letters written on fine paper in an elegant, educated script. The letters, donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 1924 by the property developer who recognized their historical significance, were all addressed to my son and signed simply with the initial C. The contents described in fragmentary but emotional terms. A plan for escape to the north that had been arranged with careful detail, mentioning a contact in Vicksburg and passage booked on a riverboat. But the final letter, dated August 10, 1840, expressed sudden fear that someone had betrayed their intentions, and that time was running out. In 1998, a team of archaeologists from Louisiana State University, conducting a comprehensive survey of antebellum plantation sites, received permission to excavate portions of the former Rosewood estate, by then subdivided into residential properties, but still containing areas that had never been developed. Using ground-penetrating radar to map the historic plantation grounds, the team identified several anomalies in an area approximately 50 yards from where the cottage had stood, well outside the boundaries of the official family cemetery. Excavation revealed 2 graves, both unmarked and unrecorded in any cemetery registry or plantation document. The first grave contained skeletal remains that forensic anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Morrison, who examined them at the LSU laboratory, determined belonged to a young woman between 20 and 25 years of age who had died sometime in the mid-19th century. Analysis of artifacts found with the remains, including fragments of fabric and a corroded metal button, suggested burial around 1840. The second grave, located less than 3 feet from the first, presented an even greater mystery. Though it showed clear evidence of having been excavated to the same depth and dimensions as the first grave, with soil composition indicating disturbance consistent with burial practices of the period, it contained no human remains whatsoever. Dr. Morrison's report noted that the grave had been opened and re-excavated within a short time after the original burial, evidenced by soil layering patterns and the absence of significant settling that would occur over longer periods. In 2003, DNA analysis was conducted on bone samples from the remains, with results that Dr. Patricia Chen of the University of Mississippi Medical Center described as consistent with an individual of mixed African and European ancestry, though the degradation of genetic material after more than 160 years made definitive conclusions difficult. What could be determined with greater certainty, however, was that the woman had suffered trauma before death. Multiple fractures to the ribs and evidence of healed breaks to the left forearm suggested a history of physical violence, though whether these injuries contributed to her death remained impossible to establish given the skeletal condition and the absence of soft tissue that might have revealed additional information. In 2015, a genealogist named Jennifer Blackwood, researching her maternal family history for a personal project, discovered documents in the archives of the Philadelphia Home for Children that would forge an unexpected connection to events at Rosewood Plantation 175 years earlier. The records showed that her great-great-great-grandfather, a man who had lived his entire life under the surname Rosemont, and about whom family knowledge extended back only to his childhood in Philadelphia, had arrived at the orphanage in September 1840 as an infant of approximately 4 weeks old. The intake records, preserved in remarkable detail, noted that the child had been delivered by a well-dressed gentleman who refused to provide his name or any information about the infant's parentage, but paid a substantial sum to ensure the child's care and education, equivalent to nearly $8,000 in period currency. The benefactor had specified only that the child should be raised as a free person, educated in letters and trade, and never told of his origins. Most intriguingly, the surname Rosemont appeared to have been assigned by the orphanage staff rather than provided by the person who delivered the child, possibly derived from a detail mentioned during the transaction that the records did not preserve. Jennifer's research led her to Rosewood Plantation through genealogical databases that traced 19th-century property records, and she discovered the Philadelphia property deed in Whitmore's manumission documents, the intended refuge that was never used. A daguerreotype in her family collection, taken in 1860 and showing her ancestor as a young man, underwent forensic facial comparison analysis in 2016, with specialists noting bone structure and facial proportions consistent with what would be expected in Harold Whitmore's biological descendant, though such analysis cannot provide definitive proof across so many generations. The truth of what happened to Celeste on that August night in 1840, whether she died in the fire as the unmarked grave suggests, or whether the elaborate cover-up concealed something even more sinister, remains ultimately unproven despite nearly 2 centuries of fragmentary evidence. What the scattered pieces suggest is a story of obsession that crossed the boundaries of law and custom, perhaps genuine affection that could never be acknowledged, and a tragedy that powerful men worked systematically to erase from history, leaving only fragments, questions, and one possible descendant who carries within her DNA the echo of events that antebellum Mississippi society deemed too scandalous to record.